Okay, welcome back for the afternoon programming. We're going to start with a panel on religion and memory. And I'm very excited about this panel. This is three people at the table I adore and respect greatly. All awesome humans and scholars, and I'm really excited to see this this panel. And it'll be followed by, at 3:15, a panel on the 30th anniversary of Srebrenica. And for the online audience, FYI, we're not recording the event tonight. There's not going to be an online event from 5:30 to 6:30. It's only going to be live. So want to be clear about that. If you need to walk anywhere, please try to duck and avoid the camp, just like that. That was perfectly done, Ari. And restrooms outside. If you need caffeine like I do, there's coffee out there. It's a desert. If you need water, you got that too. So very excited to hear Kate and DeAnna speak, and I'll hand it over to Devin. It's your show now.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Devin Burns. I'm an assistant teaching professor of religious studies at Arizona State. So I am really happy to be able to be kind of with these panelists and thinking about this kind of relationship between religion, memory, genocide, violence. I'll just keep adding keywords if I continue. But we're going to start off with the panelists presenting, and then we will go into a little bit of discussion and Q&A, and that'll kind of wrap us up. So sit tight, because we're going to get started. So our first panelist is Kate Temoney. She is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Religion and special advisor to the provost on interdisciplinary initiatives at Montclair State University. She is a member of the United States Holocaust Museum Committee on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust, and an editor for Genocide Studies and Prevention in International Journal. Her scholarship examines the intersections of religion, human rights, genocide, and theory of history. Recent works include Religion and Genocide Studies in the Handbook of Genocide Studies from Edward Elgar Press, Memory, Religion, and Authoritarianism in Post-1994 Genocide Rwanda in the Journal of Hostility, Anger, Repression, and Malice, or HARM, and History, Memory Studies, and the Grammar of Religion in the Oxford Handbook on History and Memory, which is forthcoming this year with Berber Bevernage. On a different note, she is also an alumni of Florida State, as am I. So this is a very Florida State heavy panel. So go Noles. But at this point, I will turn it over to Dr. Temoney, who will start her presentation.
So thank you. And before, no, I'm not going to leave the mask on so you can breathe a sigh of relief. Like, you won't be able to see my lips moving. So it is very nice to be here. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And I'm honored to be a part of this panel. Thank you to Ari and to Lisa and to Tim and to Volker and to Alex and to Bjorn for the invitation and for making sure everything runs well. I will do my best to stay still because that's what I've been asked to do, and I'm a full-service academic. So thank you again, for all of you, for being here. If there's anything that anybody knows about me as a presenter, there's two things. One, I do tend to move around a lot, which I'll try not to do. And then one is I love to run on the board. So one thing that I will do to kind of frame this presentation, and for those of you who might be interested in knowing a little bit more about what I'm presenting on, or so far as taking notes, if you don't want to have to do that, or if you just want more follow-up or have a bibliography to go to think about other readings that are related to what I'm talking about, as was mentioned earlier by Devin, this is actually based on an article that came out last year in HARM, and it is an open source journal. So it's not behind a paywall, and you can very easily access it. So what I'd like to do to kind of give us a larger framework, and this will be one of the few times I do move away, a framework for what we're talking about, is that there's this gentleman I have been working with at Ghent University, whose name is Bevernage, and he's Belgian. And so he does a lot of work with the Congo. And so based on some of the work that we've done together, because he does theory of history, I do religion, and we've kind of dipped into each other's pools, if you will. And so one piece that we wrote together, other than this piece that's coming out in the Oxford Handbook, Another piece that we wrote together actually looks at historical understanding and reconciliation after violent conflict. That's the title of the piece. And so when we were working together, and as I was working on this, I started to see some connections. And so one broader structure I'd like to give you to maybe think about what we're doing is that in this article that we wrote together, there were 3 ways that we've tried to think about how people approach reconciliation. And what I'm talking about here in Remember Religion and Authoritarianism is that I want to argue that Kagame's kind of campaign of reconciliation is based on these elements, right? So this is where the reconciliation comes in. Is that there are different ways of thinking about reconciliation, and there are different ways of thinking about the past in order to do that. And if you think about it, things like religion, memory, history, they're all different ways or methods of accounting for the past, right? About pastness. And so the 3 models that we propose in this piece that we wrote together, one that we call the cognitive recovery of truth. The second one we called intersubjective reframing. And then the third one we called ethical recognition. So in case kind of having broader categories by which to think about these ideas is helpful, this might be one way of looking at it. So very briefly, because I want to make sure we have time to get to this and to have questions, is that the cognitive recovery of truth is very similar to what we often think about as history. So this is where you have historians who are trying to figure out ways to quote unquote reveal or uncover the truth of what actually happened as a basis for reconciliation. So there has to be a kind of agreed upon reality as to what occurred, partly because you need to hold people responsible, right? So it tends to be very linear, right? And how we think about time and how we think about people's responsibility. And it also tends to distance the past from the present. Whereas intersubjective reframing is more about not a truth that needs to be recovered, but about a story, about a narrative that you craft about what happened. And so this could often, and we call this intersubjective, this could often involve people coming together and then trying to figure out how are we going to understand our pastness, and then how moving forward are we going to come together around a shared narrative that might allow us to establish or reestablish a kind of unified identity. This third one, ethical recognition, is the one, and this in some ways speaks to some of the things that Don was talking about earlier about indigenous ways of thinking that often tend to be circular. This is the one that's probably the most friendly to that way of thinking about history, because this one doesn't involve having to think about a more linear idea of history or even having to have a shared identity around that history. This one is you simply respect the fact that you're probably going to have different versions of what happened. And that in some cases, you actually don't want to be subsumed under a larger grand narrative. We sometimes call these subaltern narratives. Somebody like Chakrabarti is probably really well known for these kinds of things. And so what I'm talking about today probably fits best in this one. So I want to argue that the Kagame regime is pursuing a kind of intersubjective reframing, whereby in trying to think about how you're going to bring Hutus, Tutsis, and Twa, which often get left out of the conversation, how you're going to bring them together is around this kind of shared identity. And I want to argue that this shared identity he tries to craft in lots of different ways. And I want to point to maybe the fragility of that particular project. So this might be a way of kind of thinking largely about where something like this might fit. This is good? Perfect. This is perfect. Okay. So how are we going to then share our time that we have? And so one is I want to kind of make 3 separate but interrelated arguments. So one of them is this idea as a background of a kind of memory cultivation. So you have to remember we have the Rwanda Genocide, 1994. You have Kagame, who, by the way, as many of you may know, has just gotten a 4th term, which means that he can stay in power until about 2034. And this recent re-election kind of got Rwanda back in the news, as well as something else I'll talk about a little later, which is the mass closing of churches and mosques, which just happened. It was like a second stint. There was one in 2018, And then there was like kind of another wave in 2024, like in August. And so these are reasons why some of these issues have come back up in the news, even though I wrote this and published this before some of those things happened. So what I want to argue is that this narrative or this shared identity that the Kagame regime is trying to build, it's kind of based on or heavily dependent on what I have here is repatriated Tutsi. So you have to remember of the roughly 800,000 Tutsi that were killed, that many of those who then came back to Rwanda and settled were those who had fled during uprisings before. And so they are coming back and kind of repatriating. So they were abroad, they were in Uganda, right? They were in Congo, they were in other places. And so, but they're the majority of those who are now there, and they occupy positions of power within many of the governmental positions and other civil society positions. So there's a revisionist narrative whereby Kagame seems to be using this idyllic past of what Rwanda was like as a basis for this revisionist narrative, and that this revisionist narrative tries to perform this kind of cultural memory more broadly that's meant to kind of coalesce people around a shared identity. But again, it's a revisionist history. But remember, history is rarely completely linear, and we often have to keep reinventing or maintaining history. And so for him, I think that he needs what I call these frozen memories of these Tutsis that have come back that have these really idealized ways of thinking about Rwanda. So I want to say that that's dependent upon the frozen memories of those who have repatriated, as well as some of the memorialization efforts in Rwanda that kind of take these two things and kind of hold them in place. So that's kind of one part of the argument. The other two parts of the argument is that in looking at that, if you look at much of Rwandan culture, I'm going to use two people. I'm going to use Awaks and I'm going to use Osman. So these two gentlemen who are now since no longer with us, right? Who I think could give us some ways of theoretically thinking about this particular, what I say, this kind of program or this campaign of reconciliation. And so this goes to number one, where there seems to be a kind of memory inversion that he's attempting in this revisionist narrative. And what I mean by that is that if you look at someone like Awaks, he makes arguments about how he thinks different types of memory pass into each other. And it seems as though there's been a kind of inversion of that. So I'll get into that in a little more in a moment. And then here, this also needs to be a kind of transmission. So it's not good enough to just come up with a revisionist narrative. You need people, promulgate it. People have to believe in it. You have to have some mechanism for that. And so I argue that maybe two ways of doing that have been through things like public dances, and I'll show you a little clip of that in a moment. And it's very nakedly a way of bringing together, I mean, they're not hiding it, right? It's clear that there's this amalgam of histories they're trying to bring together to unify the community. But also another way of doing this is through the use of different types of sites, for instance, like the palace and museums, as a way of communicating that there is a Mwami, or that Kagame is like the new Mwami, that I'm the new leader, religious leader of the community. And so I want to argue that those kinds of ways of trying to promulgate and maintain and keep reinforcing this revisionist narrative is part of what's required in order to try to keep this in place. And then last, because I am a religion scholar, so of course religion's got to be in here somewhere. And so the religious aspects that I see of this, and I see it as kind of a three-pronged approach, is that one, because, and many of you might know, that many people in Rwanda are religious. They affiliate with a particular religion. And so Catholicism is still, even though it's dwindled, Catholicism is still the majority tradition. Then you have Pentecostals, you have Seventh-day Adventists, you have, to a much smaller degree, you have Muslims, right? So we're still a very religious country. And so in trying to figure out how he can maintain this narrative, and I'm going to argue in a moment that this is also crucial to this inversion of what I call of a collective memory, is that you have to somehow maybe eschew religion, because he wants to curb the authority of religious communities that are there, but also embrace religion as a way of trying to legitimize his new narrative. And so that's how religion's going to come in later. So this is kind of roughly the order in which we're going to proceed. And so I'm just going to give a little more detail about each of these points in the hopes of bringing it all together and bringing it home for you. So let's just look at these, some of these things I brought up in a little more detail. So I mentioned these two people, Awaks and Osman. So Oblaks indicates that in all societies, religion is an essentially conservative social phenomenon which seeks to preserve through time the pure memory of an ancient past that is less preserved than reconstructed. So again, it's not as though memory or the preservation of memory just happens on its own, right? You have to maintain it. You have to reinforce it. And one of the ways that you can do this, and Osman in some ways, and talk about cultural memory, sees himself, I think, as an extension of much of Oblak's work, is that memory encompasses social, historical, and mythical time, which I want to argue that revisionist history that Kagame is promulgating consists of, and is symbolized through stable objects of collective memory transmission or culture. So I want to argue those stable objects are things like museums. It is things like those dance performances. So that's how I'm kind of bringing those two together. So then the question becomes, where's this inversion coming from that I keep referencing? Well, according to Oblaks, and keep in mind, these are not discrete stages, but it is a kind of roughly common sense way we often think about how history is developed, is that you have individuals, that's one element, and individual memories. Those individual memories are the basis for a collective memory. And then over time, that collective memory can pass into what we think of as history. So people kind of confer upon a kind of authority over the way in which we're going to understand our past. And so again, they're not discrete, they kind of reinforce each other, but typically it takes individuals to make up a collective, right, that then is going to pass into this shared history. So what I want to argue is that it seems as though maybe Kagame is doing it in reverse, which is I have this particular history, this idyllic history that I want to give to you, that's a revisionist history. And then I want that to somehow be part of a collective memory and consciousness, but that I then want to penetrate your individual way of thinking about your relationship to this past. And so where I see religion playing a role in this is that you then have to then penetrate both public spaces and private spaces in order for something like that to happen. And then many in Rwanda are very resistant to a top-down way of thinking about this kind of reinforcement of memory culture. So you need both a top-down and you need a bottom-up in order to make this effective. And so to just revisit this very quickly, where does this kind of idea of an idyllic history come from? Again, it's based, I think, on and hinges upon in some ways amongst these frozen memories of those who've repatriated. So they've been exiled, they grew up with all these stories and this kind of regal dynastic past of Rwanda, which they were cut off from when they had to flee. And so there's almost like this incubator of a romantic way of thinking about Rwanda. And then they come back. And then most of them are educated because they weren't there through some of the memorials, right? So the memorials are for the public, but in some ways it's also for those who are repatriating. And so in doing this, that's one part of the element. And in doing this, it seems as though that they're at the cornerstone of trying to hold up this idyllic past because they're very invested in it. And that idyllic past is, there are no problems here, nothing to see here, right? We're all Rwandans. This division, right? We come from this group of people who are simply have social stratification, right? But there wasn't any significant infighting. And we no longer identify as Twa or Hutu or Tutsi because that's what divided us in the first place, right? So that kind of embracing of a Rwandan identity, I think in part depends on that kind of notion that we have this idyllic past that we can look to that doesn't have the divisiveness. Let's see. So let's move on to the next slide because I want to be able to show you this video. How much time do I have, please?
Like 6 minutes.
6 minutes, perfect. So what I would like to do is to show you this quick video because I keep saying, well, what are these ways of thinking about the past? Actually, no, I'll go back really quickly. So there's two ways I think we can think about this. One is, it's maybe a little hard to see, but that bottom right corner, that is at that picture above the top, that's a picture of a Mwami. This is a dynastic king who is of Tutsi lineage. By the way, Kagame is also, quote unquote, of Tutsi lineage, you can't say that. And next to a palace, during his regime, they built a replica of one of these thatched roof round buildings, which the Mwami occupied. And so many have commented on the fact that his doing that is his way of channeling that I am the new Mwami. And the Mwami was always somebody who was a divine king, right? It was somebody who was actually chosen by God. And so that projection and that kind of co-opting of religion and of something that already those within the community believe in is one way of exercising or using to his advantage kind of religion, where, as I'll argue in a moment, but at the same time trying to curb the influence of religious traditions. The other way in which I think you can produce this kind of stable cultural artifact. So one might be something like this, right, through this, through the building of this. Another one is through these cultural performances, which are very public. So this is Ngazi Ngere, and I just want to show you a quick clip. So let's see.
Inganzongari is a statutory traditional dance troupe that was created in 2006. The main purpose of its creation was to promote the Rwandan folkloric dance among the youth and their welfare through art. Since its creation, Inganzongari officially ranks as the best of the existing troops, and their accreditation is done through a series of competitions and evaluation by competent bodies. This prize list has recognition on the professional scene, where the troupe is regarded as a professional and talented group. And among the Rwandan community, Inganzongari has already left footprints and has become the favorite troupe.
We welcome our friends from the Inganzo Nigari dance troupe. What you see here is a traditional victory dance from Africa, displayed at a warrior's triumphant return from war.
During its participation in the International Folkloric Festival of Singapore, Mallorca in Spain, South Africa, Turkey, Russia, Nigeria, Gabon, and more African countries. As the name of the dance troupe tells it, Inganzongari is a dance troupe which focuses on research about Rwandan traditional dances. It also includes international dances, especially African dances.
So what I hope you noticed, and this is also something that's often been noted about the Kagame regime, is that he is using an idyllic past in order to chart a future. So there's a sense of moving forward. He's a technocrat, right? He's been able to stabilize Rwanda. Economically, they've been very prosperous. He's kind of like an international darling. He receives a lot of aid. So you can see there that you have this literally called, Ngaze Nagari literally means like large creation. And so he has these different histories that have come together, but it has like an international flair, which you probably saw there. And these events are always at very official events, is where these performances happen. And so the last thing that I'll share then, in looking at this last slide, is that I promised at the beginning, I said, well, what are the religious aspects of this? And so one of them is that it seems as though that there is both a destructive role that religion played in the 94 genocide that he's often very quick to remind people of as a way of kind of sidelining the influence of religion. But then also, as I mentioned before, 2018 and again in 2024, there was this mass closure of churches. Now, what's interesting is that early on in his regime, he actually relaxed the ability for people to be able to build lots of churches. And so they just kind of like just exploded. And some of them were like tents, some were in caves, right? There were various kinds of different kinds of communities. but then start to crack down on them because they were seen as challenging his authority. And so he would then come up with ways to try to curb their influence, but some of them seemingly very legitimate, like health concerns, safety concerns for some of the buildings, people being swindled out of their money, right? So there were legitimate reasons to try to make sure there was some regulation, but many who won't, who will not go by name have said, but it's really just a cover to try to make sure that he can sideline any criticism through these communities. So that's why earlier I said, I think religion is playing 3 different roles for him. I think one is you need to sideline those religious communities that might challenge you. And at the same time, by doing things like requiring those who are responsible for entire communities of churches, they have to go through some kind of like accreditation process, theological training that only they can approve of. So now what is left, you're going to try to maintain that space. And in this particular context, those spaces are often where a lot of private internalization of these narratives can happen. Because remember, if there's a mistrust of narratives from above, you got to do it from below. And you can do it from below by influencing private spaces like churches that you control. And then last, but he still is co-opting the power and the force of religion for himself by saying, I'm the new Moami, right? Or by saying, he even said, I think what we're involved in and trying to reconcile is actually a religious duty, right? So he'll often use language of religion and kind of, saddle up to it in ways that he thinks are very helpful to him. And so where I'll close, and this actually, I'll say this inspired by a conversation I had over breakfast. We were talking about films. And so those of you who have seen The Godfather, there is a line where he says, leave the gun, but take the cannoli. Here I'm going to say, leave the churches, but take God, right? Is what he's kind of going on here. So he sees this kind of godly vision of leadership that he's promulgating, but he wants to really make sure that he sidelines, again, that he wants to leave behind the what we call more traditional religions. And so where I'll leave it is that this is sometimes referred to by a gentleman like Luckman as what we call an invisible religion, which is whereby it's not the traditional world historical traditions like Christianity or Islam, but it has the same force in the sense that it's an overall framework that provides meaning. So that's where I'll leave it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Temoney. That was fascinating. That has all of my wheels turning. I can't wait to hear everyone's discussions and questions about that. But before we get to that, we are going to have DeAnna Daniels present her work. So DeAnna is an assistant professor of Africana and Religious Studies with a PhD in religion in the African American religion concentration from Rice University from 2023. She's at the University of Arizona right now. She embarked on her academic pursuits by attaining a BA in Religious Studies from Alma College in Alma, Michigan. Furthering her education, DeAnna earned a Master of Divinity in 2013 and a Master of Theology in 2014 from Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. In 2015, she expanded her expertise by acquiring a Master's of Arts in American Studies with a graduate certificate in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies from Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. While at Lehigh University, DeAnna distinguished herself by being awarded a Stroll Grant and the prestigious Research Excellence in Humanities and Social Sciences Award. In 2020, she earned a Master's of Arts in Religion from Rice University. DeAnna's dedication and scholarly achievements have been recognized through her appointment as the 2022 to 2023 Forum for Theological Exploration Doctoral Fellow. Additionally, she was honored with the 2022 Honorary Dissertation Fellowship from the Louisville Institute. DeAnna's scholarly interests are diverse, focusing on Black religion, the intersection of gender and sexuality, Black speculative fiction and horror, popular and visual culture, and art and aesthetics. Additionally, her research engages critical theory, disability theory, Black studies, and cultural studies.
Thank you. That was actually fascinating, and my wheels are also turning. So I'm super excited for the conversation. Thank you to everybody that made this possible. I'm super, super excited to be here. I always feel weird saying excitement in the word genocide, but here we are. So today's talk is Monstrous Testimonies, and this is just based off of my current research. I am trying to create a Black teratology, which is basically the Black study of monsters. I think monsters are really fascinating. I think of myself as a monster. And so because of this, I'm always interrogating how monsters show up in the world. So a lot of this presentation is based off this work that is forthcoming. And I'm super excited to hear your thoughts, concerns, and questions. But first, I want to start with a quick quote as a charge to this moment from Mariami Kaba, who says, "So many of us are afraid to speak the word. We are afraid to lay claim to it. It's too awful to believe. No, it sounds too conspiratorial, too pessimistic, too alienating, too something. Yet there it is at the forefront of our minds and on the tip of our tongues. When we are feeling brave and safe amongst those we love and trust, we sometimes whisper the words, genocide, genocide, genocide." All right, so I just want to start some things really quickly. We're going to get the religion out of the way so we can get to the other stuff. But before I do that, does anybody like horror? Yes, some people. Okay. What's your favorite movies? Just throw them out. Yeah, if you like it, you got to have a favorite, right? Come on. I don't want to do this by myself. So I'm sorry?
The Mist.
The Mist. Yes. What's another one?
No.
No, of course, that's one of my favorites. Any others?
Alien.
Alien, yes, right? So all of these films, you know what they have in common? Genocide, right? But they might not be called that. And so this presentation is trying to think through those intersections in a particular kind of way. So to get out the definition of religion, I want to frame it in this way. I take up my advisor's work, who is Dr. Anthony Penn, in his book, Terror and Triumph. He posits that the definition and the standard of Black religion and religion generally is the quest for complex subjectivity. It has its impulse in terror. And as a good graduate student, I said, no, no, it doesn't. Terror is wrong. Let's conceptually think this differently. And so I decided to define it as the impulse is tied to horror. And I'll get more into that in a bit later. But horror is the impulse for complex subjectivity, or it is the start to the quest, which inevitably is religious in its orientation. So this allows us to think of religion expansively and broadly. We don't have to define it and contain it within doctrines, ideologies, institutions, or people, though they might try. So we can kind of have an expansive understanding, especially when we're dealing with film and the speculative, which sometimes kind of blurs those boundaries. So what do stories, myths, and fiction do for us? It helps us escape. It's cathartic, right? It helps us feel good, especially about histories that are unentangled, histories that haven't been completed, and histories that we think got it a bit wrong, right? It helps us feel good to kind of switch those narratives, offer some type of alternatives, think about something different. But it also provides memory, especially in the Black US context. It is the place where we figure out what actually happened. And in light of our current political and cultural context, where in which history is being actively wiped out yet again, right? The history shows up through the film. It also grounds us in a particular form of reality. If you feel like you're haunting someone, if you feel like a monster, seeing others in that same space allows you to understand how to move through the world. But it helps us speculate about the past, the present, and or the future. Also, just because I like it, it's fun. We like to watch it. It engages us, right? But it also, if I can get it to switch, because it doesn't like me. Okay, yeah, it does religious work, right? And not religion in the typical sense, right? But so we're thinking deity, supernatural, all those entities. Yes, it can do that, but it doesn't have to. But religion as that quest for complex subjectivity, as we already framed, there is the full definition if you so would like to read it. But myth, stories, and fiction creates moments where people can articulate and exemplify the who, the what, the where of human existence. All right, so I'm gonna let you read that and just go into the presentation. So horror as a genre continually expands, evolving through its many tropes and subgenres, with the monster at its core. Whether imagined or real, feared or revered, monsters reflect and unsettle our deepest anxieties about religion, the afterlife, and most crucially, what it means to be a human. Yet, as Lisa Skitulski says, the label of criminal or evil has historically been projected onto those targeted for genocidal violence, justifying their destruction by framing them as threats to the social order, just like the monster. Horror exposes this logic, revealing how monstrosity is not inherent, but constructed to legitimize exclusion, violence, and then inevitably erasure. So the genre in its exploration of the liminal and the transgressive is uniquely suited to interrogate how race, religion, and power define and police the boundaries of the human, often forcing us to confront the historical and ongoing realities of anti-Black genocide. Yes, I said anti-Black genocide. Yao Costa Vargas, in its work, The Liberation Imperative of Black Genocide, highlights that there is an ongoing marginalization and rampant premature preventable death happening to Black persons in the diaspora. It gets framed now as anti-Black violence, but its insidious regimes should be reconsidered through the framework of genocide, anti-Black genocide. However, in the US context, genocide is not usually causally or effectively linked to the Black experience. Yet, anti-Black genocide has a ubiquity, a persistence. It is social death par excellence, and it is spreading like wildfire. I, like Costa Vargas and others, Zoe Samudzi, and a host of other Black scholars are now choosing to understand the enslavement process, all of its rituals of reference and its after effects, and its enduring spatial contingencies as Raphael Lemkin's expanded 1944 definition. The definition that includes genocide as broadly conceptual, right? So for Lemkin, the definition did not require killing. It included actions that infringed on the liberty, the dignity, and the safety of the members of a group. It included attacks on the political, the cultural, and the economic institutions. And so seeing this definition in light of where we are in the world, right, this definition holds particularly true now. So this leads me to the work of Adriana Caballero, whose book, Horrorism, offers a new understanding to name contemporary outpourings of violence. Horrorism highlights the perspective of the victim over the perpetuator of the violence. So, with that framing of my work now, I tend to engage Black horror and its many tropes as entangled with Black religious thought and culture. Beyond seeing how horror and terror, the monster shows up in Black religion and religiosity. So I engage and extend Anthony Penn's definition of Black religion as a quest for complex subjectivity, seeing horror as the impulse toward religious activity and engagement. Horror for me is capacious. It's premised upon terroristic enactments on the flesh, dread and anxiety, knowledge, and repulsion. See, we usually frame terrorism and genocidal acts through the lens of terror. It says that it's external, it's a looming threat, the anticipation of violence, right? Horror is internal, the realization that the self has already been undone, fragmented, rendered as monster, criminal, victim, or other. Horror traffics in the know and the memory. The intersection between knowing and not knowing is terror to horror for me. So horror forces us to confront the fractured self under systems of violence and enduring death. So it is complex subjectivity, the complexity being rendered through the knowledge that we live in a world where terror exists. So in my work, and I present this to you, I'm trying to theorize the monster. How does the monster grapple with this? But before that, let's talk about the monster a bit. So some bodies are perpetually monstrified due to the monster's cultural, phenomenological, and political construction. Monstrosity functions through the imperial gaze as a mechanism for distinguishing the civilized from the monstrous, or who can be rendered dead. Initially conceived as a means of identifying physical differences, phylogenic, monstrosity has become deeply embedded in the political formulations, so it's now sociogenic, justifying the continued governance, control, and inevitable genocidal eradication of entire populations. The shift reveals monstrosity as a biopolitical mechanism, a tool wielded to enforce social hierarchies and maintain systems of power. Black monstrosity is a process, not a state. So Blackness has been rendered monstrous through theological, social, and legal constructions. Slavery, colonialism, and scientific racism all work to ungender, dehumanize, and render Black people as monstrous problems rather than full subjects. To that end, the Black monster, through the logics of anti-Blackness, can be eradicated at will and without punish. Without that productive shame or paralyzing guilt that Paul Gilroy says happens after genocide. Blackness never gets that. We don't think of enslavement as genocide, and so therefore we don't have spaces to mourn, to grieve, but also for those who enacted that harm to kind of feel guilt and apologize, and how we get to some type of reconciliation. So what is it to be done about this? How do we deal with this? Focusing on the process alone is not helpful. Once again, we do know the story all too well. However, engaging how the monster achieves its aims, survival, rememory, veneration, change, reconciliation, whatever it chooses to do, and this also includes vengeance, in light of the rendering process becomes more generative, exciting, and intriguing if we're not looking at the causal effects, but how you deal with it. Turning to horror film allows us to theorize, strategize, and develop plans for survival and resistance that are not premised upon valorization or the positive. I fully believe the aliens are coming. How are you going to deal with it? I fully believe zombies might show up. Are you going to fight a zombie? Are you going to kill the zombie? Well, that might depend on your ethical considerations. I might say, you know what? I'm a pacifist. I'm not killing people. Let a zombie come through the door. I might renegotiate. Horror lets us talk through that and come to the realities, right? It is catharsis, and it is, as Tanner Reeve famously says, Black history. It gives cinematic and literary engagement with the already always spectacularization of Black death, pain, and genocide. So for one, it is the place where genocide is finally given terminology, especially for Afro-descended folks, and finally given a language and a grammar to the Black experience of continued and perpetual anti-Black violence. So, whiteness through the logic of anti-Blackness has manufactured a history, a language, and a social function that renders Blackness as a permanently monstrous race, a monster race, using the construction of monstrosity to justify violence, subjugation, and extermination. So, I want to be very clear. This is my theory, so this is all new, so TM me. What happens is we live in a world where the monster is perceived. Someone has to call it out. Someone has to say it. It is a category. It's a category exchange. So you say, there's a monster. Now, once you have claimed someone as a monster, that monster then does things. And no matter what that monster does, because you have now claimed it as monster, it becomes monstrosity. However, these are perceptions. These are mirroring images. It is based on outside categorizations. So once I've been rendered a monster and everything I do is monstrosity, what am I supposed to do? Do I stop moving? Do I stop living? Do I stop engaging? Do I stop trying to survive? Absolutely not. But then that means that the only way I can move are through those two parallels. So I begin to engage in what is considered the monstrous. So though these categories are used interchangeably, they're incredibly distinct yet overlapping. For me, the monstrous is the most important and the most engaging because that's the only time that the monster itself speaks, right? So if you think about Frankenstein says, hey, you put me in this world and you didn't give me any options. You didn't give me companionship. You didn't let me live life. So now I'm gonna do what I'm gonna do, right? And that might mean rampant death. That might mean horror, right? But through the lens of the monstrous, it becomes legible. We get to understand the grammar and it premises it on how people survive, not so much the terroristic acts that put them in that place. All right. So, colonial and imperial histories have systematically rendered Blackness and all others deemed inferior, not just as monstrous, but the supreme monster, existing outside of the realm of humanity. This rendering is not merely symbolic. It is foundational to the genocidal logic that continues to shape policies, policing, and global anti-Blackness. This perception is deeply embedded in culture, refusing to shift even as societies evolve. Because Blackness is not simply marked as monstrous, it is positioned as political nothingness, an entity that exists as subhuman, superhuman, and inhuman all at once, a form without form. And so the cinematic space has long reflected this process, from the birth of a nation to films like King Kong to the recurrent depiction of Africana religious traditions like Voodoo and Ifa and Conjure as always monstrous and demonic in horror films, including The New Exorcist, Believer, and countless others. These narratives do not simply depict horror, but they reinforce and reproduce the genocidal logic that positions Blackness as something to be feared, contained, and then ultimately eliminated. Race has long undergirded the Gothic and horror discourse, shaping literature and film as sites where racialized bodies are configured through monstrosity, rendered as objects of discourse rather than subjects of experience, further creating genocidal effects. As Maisha Wester argues, minoritized bodies become permanent vessels for exploring fear, suffering, and destruction, reinforcing that status as monstrous. Now, theorists and writers of colors, including W.B. Du Bois, Frantz Fanon, Ralph Ellison, and the Toni Morrison, have long turned to the Gothic and horror aesthetics to depict the lived and after effects of horrors of anti-Black genocide. Now, horror theorists such as Jack Halberstam and Teresa Godu have further explained how Black subjecthood is configured through the figure figure of the monster, both confirming and interrogating its function within racial capitalism and its variety of genocidal productions. However, much of the discourse surrounding Black monstrosity has remained fixated on either reclaiming Black humanity or critiquing negative representations, tying Black monster studies to unending cycles of terror. We can't change the rules with the master's tools. So this hyper-focus on monstrosity as a site of suffering often leaves little room for thinking beyond destruction, beyond erasure, toward alternative forms of existence and meaning-making. The response for many has been to highlight, of course, Black morality, civility, and beauty as correctives, offering a respectable counter-narrative to the imposed monstrous image. But this approach ultimately remains bound to the white supremacist gaze, seeking validation within the very structures that produce monstrosity as a means for justifying Black death. Instead, the monstrous self must be rethought, not as a fixed category of terror, but as a generative space of radical possibility. Rather than merely resisting the label of monstrosity, I'm interested in how the category of the monstrous allows us to interrogate, renegotiate, and redefine what it means to be human, other, and everything in between. And so that means I'm interested in engaged undead bodies, absent bodies, uncategorizable bodies, techno bodies, alien bodies, ghostly bodies, all the bodies. Those who exist outside the frameworks of normative subjectivity and whose very existence disrupts the logic of genocide. So the monstrous as this liminal space offers a site of agency where those deemed other can navigate and reimagine their existence beyond the constraints of respectability or redemption and reconciliation. Salvatore de Bono suggests that monstrous subjectivity bridges that gap between social death and hegemony, offering an alternative to victimhood or assimilation. However, once again, I'm not interested in simply constructing another form of subjectivity, but rather I turn to that speculative potential of horror fiction and cinema, which highlights how these rendered monstrous bodies can recontextualize their position, not to simply claim humanity, but to redefine it entirely. So the monstrous in this sense is not merely about suffering or transgression, but it's about perpetual becoming. As theorists such as Deleuze and Guattari and Braidiati have suggested, becoming implies a movement that is fluid, disruptive, and generative. It is a refusal to be fixed, a continuous process of transformation that defies the logics of genocide and social death. The monstrous becoming, then, does not seek to escape monstrosity, but to wield it as a means of survival, subversion, and radical futurity. So to illustrate this, we can have this conversation, especially when we get to the Q&A, of the many, many examples of what becomes possible when the monstrous is engaged, not as an imposed identity, but as a capacious space of transformation. Rather than being consumed by the cycles of terror that define monstrosity under white supremacy, these entities navigate their own agency within a world that has already marked them for destruction. So in the space of the monstrous, one is simply not subjected to horror, but rather one engages horror as a means of existing, resisting, and imagining otherwise. Thus, the monstrous is not merely a reaction to oppression, but it becomes a site of radical world making. It's not about valorizing the aberrant, nor is it about bemoaning it. Instead, it is a framework for understanding how these deemed monstrous continue to exist, thrive, and shape futures beyond the constraints of genocidal logics. So horror in its most radical form does not simply reflect violence, but it reveals the possibilities that emerge when we embrace the monstrous as a space of perpetual becoming. So some examples of this is Fern in River Solomon, Sorrowland, Brianna in Candyman 2021, Adelaide and Red in Us, and what happens when monstrosity is not just imposed on Black people, but becomes a direct consequence of structural violence. Nanny is another example by Nikatu Jutsu, who says Aisha and Mami Wada and Anansi need to have some conversations because what's going on with that trickster stuff. Melanie and the girl with all the gifts who states, why is it us that have to die? If this is a new world, let's live it, so I'm gonna burn it all down. Candyman is a reflection of this process where Daniel Robitaille is not inherently monstrous. He is made monstrous through white violence, spectral memory, and urban legends of Black terror. And what does he do? He messes it all up. So we have plenty examples of these going over. So Black horror becomes more than just a genre. It is a site of reckoning, a space where the conditions of anti-Black violence and anti-Black genocide and the religious justifications that sustain it are both exposed and reimagined. The United Nations definition of genocide fails to account for the violent erasures and epistemic ruptures that have shaped Black life in the Americas. The Middle Passage, forced breeding, the systematic destruction of African spiritual systems, all constitute forms of annihilation. This also includes mass incarceration, Black maternal mortality, police brutality, eradication of cultural systems, and we can go on and on and on. Yet they are rarely, if ever, recognized as genocidal acts. We gotta say the word. So religion, particularly Christianity, has operated as both a tool of horror, but also the means of survival. The theological justifications for slavery and colonial expansions, things like the curse of Ham, manifest destiny, amongst others, are reminders that religious doctrine have been weaponized against Black life. Yet within this horror, there has always been resistance. Spirituals, conjure, radical theologies emerge as counter-narratives, refusing the theological death imposed upon Black bodies. So, take, for example, Toni Morrison's Beloved, which exemplifies the intersection of religious horror and genocide. The novel's haunting is not just a supernatural event, it's a theological crisis. The dead refuse to rest, demanding recognition of a history that the dominant culture seeks to erase. Sutha's act, monstrous in the eyes of those who would rather forget it, is also a refusal of genocide, an assertion of agency against the horror of being reduced to property. To frame horror merely as fear, to misunderstand its function within Black cultural production is grievous. Horror is the condition Black people are forced to navigate, a state of perpetual precarity where survival itself is rendered monstrous. So movies such as Get Out interrogates the horror of stolen subjectivity, where Black bodies are inhabited but never truly lived in. Lovecraft Country reclaims horror as an alternative archive, a way to unearth histories of violence and assert memory against erasure. Ultimately, to engage Black horror is to confront the horror of being and becoming under conditions of anti-Blackness by acknowledging that being and becoming are always and already present. It demands a redefinition of both horror and genocide, not as singular historical events, but as ongoing processes that shape Black existence and the existence of all of us around. In reclaiming the monstrous, Black horror does not merely depict terror, but it generates new ways of knowing, being, and ultimately resisting, and it turns the unspeakable into testimony, the haunted into witness, and the monstrous into a radical assertion of life. Thank you all.
I'm obsessed with all of that. I am just so excited to hear y'all's questions. I have questions. My questions can wait. I can talk to them later. So with that, we can start to kind of turn it over to you guys. If anyone has any questions for either DeAnna or Kate.
And I have the mic here for people who have questions. DeAnna, I was just going to say, with all this, I immediately thought of The Watchmen and the Tulsa Race Massacre at the beginning, like the opening scene, and very much ties that together.
Yeah. Which again was denied, right? No reparations, but you know it existed, so here's a sculpture.
And even the euphemisms were, right? Riot rather than
exactly. Massacre.
pogrom. Okay, questions? You're looking for either presenter.
I have one.
Yeah, go ahead.
So thank you for your presentation. So this is funny. So how often when you go to these different events, it might trigger something you recently had to talk about yourself or read? And so I'm teaching a class right now on African religions. Not my Arab expertise, but Rwanda, I'm Black, so I guess we figured I'd be the closest thing to do it. So I'm increasingly becoming more familiar with African religions. So one of the things we recently talked about is a piece by Morrison, I think, looking at Vodou, or more specifically voodoo, Voodoo, which actually doesn't exist, but in the popular imagination, it doesn't really exist. But there actually is a religion called Vodou.
Right.
And so in looking at voodoo, they make the argument that versus like anxieties, white anxieties over the Haitian Revolution, you see in popular culture, in books and in films, like in the 1920s and 30s, and hence the obsession with, like, say, zombies.
Yeah.
And so the idea is that because Haitians were able to, this is what, 1791 to like 1804, right, were the only successful slave rebellion that happens, is that a lot of that anxiety over Black bodies gets subsumed into the zombie, because the fear gets projected as, we don't want to be enslaved, and a zombie is nothing more than somebody who's perpetually enslaved. And so, and then there's a gendered aspect to that. And so I was wondering, in your work, have you come across a gendered aspect to how we might think about monstrosity? Because within zombification, there is a gendered aspect. There's a sense of the Black woman being hypersexual, or the fear of white women becoming zombies and being subjects to Black men who are seen as menacing, right? So I want to know, as you were talking, I was wondering if you see any kind of gendered conversations or contours to monstrosity.
Absolutely. So first, I do want to say voodoo does exist, right? So VOODOO does exist in the context of New Orleans, in the context of practitioners and adherents who have now made it syncretic religion, right? And have changed the orishas, where Marie Laveau is an orisha, is goddess status. So we want to give that credit as well. So yeah,
we disagree on
yes, we can disagree on that, but yeah, just like hoodoo as well. So, but again, yes, so if you notice, most of the people that I mentioned, with the exception of Candyman, are all women. I tend to look at the women characters, gendered identified femme characters, non-binary characters, as a way to understand, because of course the least of these will always be through a feminine lens. Monstrosity is premised upon, in teratology really, which is the study of the monstrous, is premised upon progeny, right? And the production of offspring that were inadequate for some strange reason, right? That they had something wrong with them. They were mentally unstable, or something was off. And so that's a monster right there. That's how it starts. And so because of this, it's always tied to the maternal line, right? Women produce these offspring that are animalistic, that are monstrous. And so we then have to categorize the offspring themselves, but also the production of it, the woman. And so the quote that I always start with is, Hortense Spillers, who talks through the ungendering of Black womanhood, saying that it's always a monstrous process. We need to start claiming it. And so the issue is that we try to negate it. We don't want to be monsters. We don't want to engage in monstrosity. We say, no, that's a category given to us. We don't want to deal with it. And what she says is, it's already here. We already have it. What if we claim it? Then we can speak to what it really does, because they don't fully understand it and they don't understand the capacity. So there's always a gendered and there's always a sexual aspect to all considerations of the monster and monstrosity. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for that. I have a question for you. Actually, at 3 o'clock, I got to run to my class where we're talking about Fanon, and I heard you mention him. We're reading Concerning Violence. So I want to know what, given that, and you mentioned other scholars in Morrison, I want to know what your ideas are to humanization. Yeah.
So violence is human, right? Fanon teaches us that in a particular kind of way. So when people think about the monstrous, they go, oh, they did something criminal, or they did something crazy, or they did something that we can't explain. It goes against social order. And so I want to contest that. I want to say the monsters that are inherent that we need to talk about are those that are committing the genocidal acts, right? So what happens is, when you think of Setha from Beloved, you think of her as a murderous mother, a monstrous mother, as she is called, because she dares to kill one of her children. But really what she's trying to do is prevent the life that she has lived, that she knows that there's no way to get free from, because she got free and is going back in that jail cell as Denver suckles the blood and the milk mixed with the death of her child sister, right? This is something that's perpetually coming up. And so we want to say, oh, no, you can't tap into violence. But why not? And so that's why the monstrous becomes generative, because we understand why Setha makes that monstrous decision. It is not because she's inherently a monster. It is because of the logics that's rendered her in this place. She was without certain options, so she had to do what she needed to do. And for her, the moment to kill her daughter was paramount to making her property. And so when you understand Blackness, or when you understand the logics of colonization, when you understand how people are trying to get free from the regime, we need to speak to it. But instead of condemning those choices, we need to condemn the situations that put them in that, right? So we need to look at the way in which it's framed, right? And so that's what we need to call out. So why are we looking at why those that perpetuate harm, why did they make that decision? I don't care about that. How do people survive when that harm has been perpetuated? That is more interesting. Those are the stories I want to hear, but they're always locked into the monstrous. And so we're not supposed to engage them. We're supposed to say, oh, well, that was a bad decision. Let's put it back there. But no one ever calls lynching genocidal. And no one ever says, don't do that, right? Instead, we use it in common language. We say, oh, when you've been canceled, you've experienced the digital lynching. No, you haven't, right? But if we took seriously the violence that's enacted on certain people's flesh, right, that might change the game. So I'm totally a Fanon person.
Thank you so much.
Have a good class.
Yeah. Enjoy.
Keisha.
Oh, I can talk loud.
It's gonna be online.
I think it's online. Yeah.
Yeah.
You, is it Dr. Temoney?
Yes.
Okay, so
Kate.
I thought I heard you correctly when you said that Kagame was lineage was
The Mwami?
yes.
Yes. Mhm.
And you said, but we're not supposed to say that.
Right.
And so I wanted to
Oh,
ask you
clarify.
why.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
Oh, no, yeah, I just meant it in a very, kind of, I just meant it in the sense that part of the perpetuation of the, a sense of a shared Rwandan identity, because the 1984 genocide and the identity cards by which people were put into particular categories as people, the regime tries to downplay the idea that there are actually distinctions amongst them. So to even say like Tutsi or I'm Twa, like you're not supposed to do that, right? You're not supposed to perpetuate the idea that there are these different people amongst the Rwandans. Yeah, that's what I
Okay,
meant by that.
got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, thanks very much. Two really fascinating talks. So I live in Southern California and I'm surrounded by Disney adults. And I also have two small children, so I watch a lot of Disney myself, unfortunately. And I was fascinated in listening to, your discussion. And I immediately thought of The Princess and the Frog, right? Which at the time that it came out, it sort of was celebrated as, the first kind of African-American centric Disney fairy tale, But of course, the protagonist spends virtually the entire film as a monster, right? She is literally dehumanized, turned into a frog. And it, of course, occurs to me that, the intersections between fairy tales and horror are, very, very thin. And so I just wonder about, I'm literally just wondering about, how you would sort of talk through or theorize something like The Princess and the Frog. I would just love to hear you sort of opine on that. And then vis-a-vis Rwanda, also really fascinating talk. I'm sure this comes up, with much greater clarity in your writing and what have you. And I will definitely want to look into that after this, after reading it. But I just wanted to hear you sort of talk through, that tension, obviously, with the Kagame regime as an authoritarian regime, but at the same time, seemingly investing so many of its resources into what we would otherwise think of as like truth and reconciliation, and like. I spent a lot of time in Bosnia and the Balkans and what have you, and the Kigali Genocide Memorial has now a working relationship with the Srebrenica Memorial Center. And it's been really fascinating to me talking with the folks in Srebrenica about their perceptions of Rwanda and Kigali as very successful, right? In part because obviously from their perception, the war in Rwanda and the genocide in Rwanda comes to an end. And it comes to an end, quote unquote, in the right way, right? And so just hearing you talk a little bit about those intersections of authoritarianism vis-a-vis genocide memorialization would be great. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, I am a Disney adult as well. I'm also a Harry Potter adult, but I also acknowledge the problematic notion of everything that is J.K. Rowling, and so we disavow. But anyway, so yes, when I teach Princess and the Frog in my course, Religion and Film, I teach it as a horrible film. It is a film that is horrifying because one, we finally get an African-American film and we get an on-screen death. Where does that happen at? We finally get an African-American princess and she's not really a princess because her king has no throne. We finally get an African-American princess, and what we see is her doing labor. Labor she loves, but labor. She does not get to be ditzy, fritzy, fabulous, right? She got to go to the restaurant. She got to work. She got to make them beignets. She's on the clock. And of course, because she wants to, we celebrate that. That's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying we don't get that option with her. And in fact, most of her merch that comes out has a little figure that we know is Lottie that's usually accompanying her, or she's a frog. All things that are deeply problematic. But what's most hurtful is that my students use the word that is taboo in my classroom, Black magic. I tell them they can't say black magic because you don't say white magic, because that's what you really mean. There is a blackness and then there's a whiteness. And so unless you're going around saying, hey, I'm practicing light or white magic today, you cannot say black magic in my class. What happens is voodoo, and voodoo, VOODOO, comes up, and conjure comes up in the negative way through Dr. Facilier. But no one mentions Mama Odie, who is a full mamba, who is a full priestess doing her full glory work, right? We don't get that there. We don't have conversations of that because it's always funneled through Dr. Facilier, the harmful one, the one that enacted harm. But if you listen to what he says in his song, he says, I got voodoo, I got hoodoo, I got things you've never seen before. And what we see is that he's enacting negative vibes for a particular end. He is a con man, not a conjure man alone. So when I teach that, I say, hey, look, once again, African forms of spirituality are being placed and demonized, seemingly unintentionally, but definitely maliciously and harmfully, right? And so until Disney rectifies that, we don't get something new from that. It continues on. And so it's just part and parcel what happens with conjure and Ifa and all of these kinds of forms of African spirituality that are continually demonized.
So thank you for your question. And if I don't answer it directly, please follow up. But if I understood you correctly, in looking at memorialization, I think part of where that might come up, and I believe that's the Aegis Trust, I think that was involved in that relationship, is that it's often seen, I think, as like the official kind of memorial by which many foreigners and others are educated, whereby most of those, especially those who are still there on the ground, that were there when it happened, tend to favor more makeshift, community-centered memorials, as opposed to this kind of more grand narrative kind of a memorial that is very much leaning into Tutsi victimization, to the point where we call it like, the genocide against the Tutsi, where, say, the Hutus who were also victimized get left out of the narrative. And so there's not an opportunity for them to really reconcile. And so I feel as though there's a lot of tension around that particular museum for those who are there. But that we tend to downplay that in the interest of the fact that violence has not yet, again, broken out, right? So the authoritarianism kind of gets a pass because it does allow us to be able to say, but look, it's working. There hasn't been another, instance of interscene violence. And because he has been able to miraculously, seemingly propel the economy forward, become hyper, kind of technologized, that there's, again, a blind eye to the fact that he's sidelining and disappearing and potentially killing those who oppose him in order to be able to keep this kind of authoritarianism in place. So, and we just got another term, right? So I feel like, so that's part of the tension. And the last thing I'll say is, my understanding is that if you talk to a lot of those who are still there, they'll tell you they're not really allowed to say anything against the national narrative. And so that's why I say I think it's fragile in the sense that always under the surface, there are people who understand, they know what's going on, but they just can't publicly say anything about it. And so I think there's always that tension there, but that international community, they didn't step in then, they're not going to step in now, right? So that's kind of, does that answer your question, I hope? Okay. I think there were two more questions. Yeah.
So first off, thank you both for your presentations. They're really interesting. I learned a lot. So what I've previously read about the Rwanda genocide has mostly focused on the events within the 1990s.
Yeah.
There's been a long history of it seems like there's a temporary success or peace agreement and then conflicts restart. The Constitution got rewritten to underscore equality, and then there were re-education camps. There were Gacaca courts and then conflict and tensions again.
Right.
So when you say that there's this idea of trying to underscore Rwandan identity as Rwandan identity, and not have the Tutsis, not have the Hutu, not have the Twa, I'm curious how that is in practice. So for example, I've heard that in India, there's officially no caste system, but people still treat each other based on that, even though it's legally not a category anymore. So are you seeing something similar in Rwanda in contemporary days? Is it something that's fading out, these sorts of ethnic distinctions that used to have these sorts of conflicts? How is the situation currently?
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, I think because I know that there are other questions, I think the succinct way I can answer that, and thank you, that's a good question, is that I think it goes back to the idea of there being like an official narrative and then what's actually going on the ground, which is your point. So the official narrative that these divisions are just based on social class distinctions, which did exist, and that which the Belgians and those who exploited the tradition then made more rigid identities, because at first those identities you could, and let's be real, people intermarried, speak the same language, religion, right? Freud talks about the narcissism of minor differences, right? So the idea that they were so close, like closer to each other is part of why it was such a, the animosity and the vitriol, of the conflict. But the idea is that, well, there were herdsmen, Tutsi, there were those who were agrarian, that's the Hutu, and there was hunter-gatherers, which were the Twa, right? So there is this sense of like, well, claim that, but we don't want to claim these rigid identities. And you can intermarry, you could go from being agrarian to being a herdsman. And but now, because that became associated with a phenotypical way of presenting, so then the Tutsis were seen as taller and thinner, the Hutus were seen as shorter, right? The Twa were seen as particularly short. So people still kind of, I think, see each other in those ways, even though they're not supposed to talk about it and they're not supposed to identify. And when you say something like the genocide against the Tutsi, like you're kind of have it both ways. And so I think people still do see each other in those ways. And everybody sees that quote unquote Tutsi that you're not supposed are actually occupying the higher levels of office within the country. But somehow you're supposed to suppress talking about it because you don't want it to cause derision. But people are still, I think, acting in ways that reinforce those identities, even if you can't claim it publicly. Yeah.
Thank you both for very, very interesting presentations. And Professor Temoney, I'm going to ask you a question and preface it by saying, I got a little worried when you were first speaking, because for me, whenever we talk about a shared narrative, that's usually deniers trying to pull people away from the truth and get a kind of middle ground that's essentially denialist. And it usually happens. And what's interesting about this, it usually happens because the perpetrator group or their supporters have power over the victim or survivor group. And what you did is completely different. You went in this other direction where you were looking at, I hesitate to call Kagame the head of a survivor community, because really the Rwandan survivor community is different from the RPG and all, and that's a whole other thing. But certainly part of the same ethnic identity, even though we can't say that.
Right.
And it's someone who is in power. And what I think is fascinating, and if you could maybe speak to this a little bit, this is a case, very rare case, where it's not the perpetrator group, but somebody at least putatively representing the victims who is exerting power for a particular reason over the narrative. And I was wondering if you could talk about, you've explained what that serves, but I was wondering if you can talk about what makes that different from the typical domination relation that we see when people try to force a kind of shared narrative that generally isn't contested. They try to get to a point of non-contestation, but the contestation is all under the surface, which is the same thing you're highlighting.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's a good question. I think a quick response to this, and I probably have to think through it even more to give you a more thorough answer, but one of the quick things that kind of comes to mind is that I wonder, and this kind of relates to both of your questions, is that sometimes I wonder if there's a kind of moral capital that you accrue by being part of the victim group. And because the international community, same thing with the Bosnian genocide, same thing with the Armenian genocide, where people just kind of stand by, it took the RPF, actually the Rwandan Patriotic Front, right, coming down from Uganda and actually ending the genocide. So he's kind of given credit for that, even though they also committed atrocities, right? But he's somehow given credit for that because the international community didn't act and he did. He's kind of part of this corporate victim group, where, even though he may not have actually physically been there on the ground. And it kind of gives you a pass in some ways that I think that you wouldn't be willing to give to the perpetrator group. That would be my initial thought. Is that?
No, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got one more question, and I have an observation I'll just share when I go back to the podium, so please.
Thank you so much to both of you. My question is for Dr. Daniels. I'm just thinking about what Edward Glissant says about opacity, sort of making, arguing against, this idea that we have to understand somebody and know them and see them fully before we can see their humanity. And Glissant just sort of saying, actually, no, like colonized people, Black people in the Caribbean have a right to opacity, right? And if you don't understand it, it's not for you, and that there's this long history of survival that is predicated on subterfuge and marronage and this opacity. And so I would love to hear you speak a little bit about how, like, the monstrous sort of deals with or grapples with this idea of of opacity, right? Like of being seen and having your humanity recognized, or, sort of this different approach of the right to opacity and the ways in which that also is necessary for continued survival.
Yeah. So no, it's a great question. And I bring up Glissant a number of times in my work, especially his abyssal womb, as a kind of impetus towards horror and then understanding how one moves. So we're in kind of a moment that seems to be kind of this kind of like global moment for horror. Horror is just doing really great things right now. And what I'm seeing is our need for representation for Blackness and diverse ways in which to engage horror, and we're getting bad things, right? We're getting a lot of movies that don't do us right, that don't really situate us. So the new movie that just came out, The Woman in the Yard, I was super excited about it, and I watched it and it was kind of like, something's missing. What is missing? Black narratives, right? And so there's a way in which Jordan Peele is so successful at what he does because he centers the Black experience without making it transparent for those who are not a part of it. So you watch it and you're laughing at the jokes, and when people don't get it, they don't laugh. And he doesn't explain it. It's the same thing that Toni Morrison does. Toni Morrison doesn't write about whiteness, right? But because the Black experience is so pivotal, so central, if you understand the experience, you get whiteness there, right? It's the same kind of thing. So there's a way in which we want representation and we want to see ourselves on screen, but we don't ever have to explain ourselves in that particular kind of way. And so that's what I'm excited about Monstrosity for and The Monstrous, because I'm tired of us saying, well, we're just being civil, we're being human. Look at our humanity. Aren't we human? No, we're not. We're dead to them, right? We're undead. Let's be zombies. Let's be vampires. Let's be ghosts. Let's haunt them, right? They're scared. We're the nothingness, right? I want that. Because that makes me feel seen in a way that me trying to fit into these moments. And I say that as a full PhD, please let me keep my job and my check, right? There's a way in which I have to be a particular kind of trans. You got to see that I can do it. You got to have the writings on the page, right? And so that's why the becoming is so much. Even as we shed layers and expose, we still become something new. Blackness is not a static point. It's fluid. And so race is not a static point, it's fluid, right? Ethnicity, gender, sexuality, all of that. So let's continually transform and become. And when they think they have a handle on us, we continue to change because violence is insidious and it does the same.
Trickster.
Yeah, that trickster. Yeah.
All right, let's have a round of applause for our two panelists. And it's fascinating. One thing I really appreciated, like event, kind of like a founding trauma, if you will, Omer Bartov says. New and unforeseen identities forged in the crucible of destruction, right? This new Rwandan identity. And you dealt with structure, right? All these stories and narratives come out of structure and reinforce them, right? But also subvert them, depending how well it's done. So the last thing, I'd be remiss if I didn't put in a plug for religious studies, because we don't always get well represented in genocide studies. Not a lot of religion scholars do genocide, and a lot of genocide scholars do religion well. And as Kate points out in one of her pieces, we're natural fit, right? Both are multidisciplinary, religious studies, multidisciplinary aspects to it, definitional, right?
So you're the one that
and religious studies and critical genocide studies, I think, go really well together. And I think the theoretical frameworks we saw here really speak to that. So I had to speak on behalf of Team Religious Studies here. So
Thank you.
all right, that I'll close it, and we're going to resume at 3:15 with our 30th anniversary of Srebrenica.